The Specter of Communism in Hawaii, 1947 to 1953. Chapter 10, HUAC comes to Hawaii. On October 7, 1949, 3 days after the longshore strike had ended, the territorial legislature passed a concurrent resolution requesting the House Committee on Un-American Activities to come to Hawaii to investigate and report on the threat of internal subversion in the territory. It was stated in the resolution that the purpose of the request was to clear the innocent as well as to identify those who might pose a real danger to Hawaii's internal security. Footnote: one of the reasons for the statement that HUAC's investigation was to protect the innocent was that Major Arthur B. Chun's name had appeared in one of the documents accumulated by the Roberts Commission studying the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. Major Chun, with the aid of Senator Thelma Akana, was seeking to have his name cleared of any communist taint. There was general agreement that Major Chun was free of suspicion of having a communist past, but there was little agreement about how his name might be cleared. It was felt that HUAC hearing would provide a forum for those who had been wrongly identified to clear themselves. Footnote end. The resolution also made it clear that one of the reasons for inviting HUAC to Hawaii was to clear the last barrier standing between the territory and statehood. No mention was made in the resolution of the recently ended strike. Copies of the resolution were sent to the President of the United States, Harry S. Truman, the Speaker of the United States House of Representatives, Sam Rayburn, Democrat from Texas, the Chairman of the House Committee on Un-American Activities, and the Delegate to Congress from the Territory of Hawaii, Joseph R. Farrington. The Honolulu Record was skeptical about the resolution, saying that the purpose was not to provide the opportunity of proving one's innocence, but to do a smear job on the Democratic Party and the ILWU. Senate President Wilfred Tsukiyama told the regular monthly meeting of the Board of Directors of the Republican Club of Hawaii his feelings about the invitation to HUAC. The thing, in my opinion, that is dangerous about those tainted with communism is that the very principle of the doctrine is one which not only advocates but encourages violence, disturbance, disorder, race clashes, and, in the end, total revolution. I am very happy that the legislature has favorably entertained a resolution to request the House Subcommittee on Un-American Activities of the Congress to come to Hawaii for the purpose of checking communist activities in Hawaii. If, however, the subcommittee should find it impossible to come to Hawaii to carry on investigations, the territory itself should undertake the same. It turned out, however, not to be a question of one or the other. On October 10, 1949, by a vote of 25 to 4, the Territorial House of Representatives passed and sent along to the Senate a bill creating a Territorial Subversive Activities Commission. 4 days later, the measure was approved by the Senate, and on October 26, 1949, the governor signed the measure into law. The idea was not a new one to the territorial legislature. 2 days before the longshore strike began, a similar measure was passed in the Senate only to die in the House. The earlier effort, however, called for a legislative committee rather than an independent commission, a feature which would inevitably have made the work of the body more political in character. Footnote: the Legislative Holdover Committee later created a subcommittee on un-American activities headed by Representative Charles E. Culhane. It was generally looked upon as superfluous and was never a significant force in the anti-communist movement. Footnote end. The key features of the Territorial Commission were that it was to be composed of 7 members, 3 of whom must be from the outer islands of Kauai, Maui, and Hawaii. The members were to be appointed by the governor with the advice and consent of the Senate. At least 3 of the members, including the chairman, were required to be attorneys licensed to practice in all courts of the territory of Hawaii. The key functions of the commission were to investigate and to file the results of their investigations with the territorial legislature. They were, significantly, restricted from making any report public without the prior approval of the governor or the legislature. The commission had subpoena power, and persons swearing falsely before the body were subject to prosecution for perjury. The initial funding for 2 years was in the amount of $75,000. Footnote: Territory of Hawaii, Laws of the Territory of Hawaii, 25th Legislature, Spec. Thes. 1949. The complete text of Joint Resolution 5, which established the Territorial Subversive Activities Commission, can be found in Appendix G. The history of the commission was not very spectacular. In the legislature's desire to prevent a witch-hunting organization, the independence of the commission was greatly limited. The coming of HUAC to Hawaii immediately after the establishment of the commission added to the organization's relative obscurity. In subsequent years, the Smith Act trial in Hawaii also eclipsed interest in the activities of the commission. As time passed, and as the hysteria over communism subsided, the legislature lowered the appropriations with frustrating, to commission members' regularity. Careful scrutiny of the semi-annual reports of the commission reveals that most of their information was derivative, that which was not was of little consequence. When the governor finally appointed the seven-man commission on December 2, 1949, his chairman was Edward N. Silva, who had presided over the Reinecke hearing. Another member who has had a prominent role in this narrative was William Borthwick, Territorial Tax Commissioner, ally of Governor Steinbach and vigorously anti-communist candidate for delegate to Congress in 1946. Footnote end. There was an air of cautious optimism among many in Hawaii that the divisive issue of communism was about to be laid to rest. The Honolulu Star Bulletin, in one of a four-part series on communism, summarized the results of 3 national investigations that had been made for the purposes of Hawaiian statehood. The first, prepared in 1946 by Representative Henry D. Larcade, Jr., of Louisiana, made no mention of communism in Hawaii. The second, in 1948, was prepared by Senator Guy Cordon, Republican from Oregon. The Cordon report recommended statehood and said that the allegations of communist influences in Hawaii are no different than those directed against other places and the situation prevailing throughout the country. Then came the Butler Report, which recommended without equivocation that statehood for Hawaii be deferred indefinitely. International revolutionary communism has, at present, a firm grip on the economic, political, and social life of the territory of Hawaii. It was the Star Bulletin's hope that Butler's allegations could now be shown to be alarmist and untrue. Between the flurry of activity following the end of the Longshore Strike and the arrival of HUAC in April 1950, much happened nationally to heat up the anti-communist passions of a nation that saw itself in the grips of the Cold War. On October 14, 1949, only a week after the end of the Longshore Strike, the 11 Communist Party leaders being tried in New York for violation of the Smith Act were found guilty. The story was given extensive coverage in the Honolulu press. Conviction of communist leaders in America of plotting to overthrow the government may not outlaw their political party, the advertiser editorialized, but it does remove the mask of innocence from Americans who remain in that party or who join it henceforth. The Honolulu Record, not surprisingly, saw the conviction differently. At Foley Square, the freedom of thought and the freedom to express beliefs were put on trial, and not criminal acts committed by the communists. In our country, it is generally accepted that ideas are not subject to trial in court. We place confidence in individuals who are free to examine ideas and to decide on the merits or lack of merits in them. During the trial, which was underlined heavily with thought control, the prosecution introduced as evidence Marxist books which are found in public libraries throughout the country and testimonies to show what these books mean. But defense efforts to present the defendant's understanding of the books were drastically curtailed. Political dissent thus became a crime. Footnote, Honolulu Record, October 20th, 1949, p. 8. Koji Ariyoshi, the editor of the record and author of the statement above, found himself, less than 2 years later, under indictment for violation of the Smith Act. Footnote end. Charles K. Fujimoto, chairman of the Communist Party in Hawaii, was even more vehement in his denunciation of the Foley Square decision. This blow against the Communist Party is not directed against the communists alone, but against all those who uphold and fight for the best ideals of freedom and democracy. Just as Hitler, Mussolini, and the Japanese militarists failed to destroy the communist parties in their respective countries, so will fascist-minded monopolists and their stooges fail to smash the communist movement in America. Footnote, Honolulu Advertiser, October 16, 1949, p. 10. In less than 2 years, Fujimoto also found himself under indictment for violation of the Smith Act. Footnote end. The pendulum was definitely swinging in favor of the anti-communists, both locally and nationally. In November 1949, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, revoked the charter of the Honolulu chapter of that organization when an unresolved leadership struggle which involved charges of communist infiltration was referred to the NAACP's National Board. There was some cause for joy among the enemies of HUAC when, in December 1949, J. Parnell Thomas, chairman of the committee during the 80th Congress, pled guilty to having padded both his office payroll and that of HUAC with names of people who did not do any work while personally pocketing the money. But Thomas Day in the limelight had already passed when the Democrats regained control of Congress in 1948. In January 1950, HUAC's reputation again ascended with the conviction of Alger Hiss for having perjured himself before HUAC in 1948 in his famous confrontation with Whittaker Chambers. In February 1950, Senator Joseph McCarthy, Republican from Wisconsin, subsequently gave his famous speech in Wheeling, West Virginia, the speech which began his reckless career as an anti-communist. By the time HUAC arrived in Honolulu in April 1950, McCarthy was staking his reputation on the assertion that Far Eastern expert Owen Lattimore was the #1 communist spy in the State Department. It was an assertion McCarthy was never able to prove, but it is a commentary upon the times that the senator was able to continue on his destructive way for another 4 years before he fell to the U.S. Army and the Army's wily counsel, Joseph Welch. Also in February 1950, the CIO began in earnest to purge itself of communist-dominated affiliates. On February 16, 1950, 4 unions, including the United Public Workers of America, which was active in Hawaii, were expelled. The unions had a combined membership of more than 100,000 members. Footnote, Honolulu Record, February 23, 1950, p. 3. The unions expelled by the CIO were the United Public Workers of America, 30,000 members, food, tobacco, agricultural and allied workers, 22,500 members, United Office and Professional Workers of America, 12,000 members, and the mine, mill and smelting workers, 44,000 members. Footnote end. The ILWU had not yet been expelled, but in 6 months it would be. On the local scene, IMUA had kept the anti-communist fires burning brightly with a monthly newspaper called IMUAS Spotlight and with 5 radio broadcasts each week. IMUA often spoke of the burden of competing with the well-financed efforts of the Communist Party. When IMUA produced figures on the public relations dollars spent by Hawaii's Communist Party, it always included in that figure an amount equal to the public relations budget for the ILWU. IMUA was not without its critics in government. W.K. Bassett, administrative assistant to Mayor John Wilson, looked upon this self-appointed group of super-Americans with great distaste. IMUA may mean forward in Hawaiian, Bassett said, but to me it means forward with a sheet over its head and carrying a flaming cross. Looking forward to the arrival of HUAC, Bassett suggested that this LMUA is something for the un-American committee members to investigate when they come to Hawaii. This LMUA, I charge, is a subversive organization, trying by force and violence of threats to overthrow reason and common sense in Hawaii. One of the reasons for Bassett's outburst was the role of IMUA in the coming Constitutional Convention, slated to begin in Honolulu on April 4, 1950, just 6 days before HUAC's hearings were to begin. This convention was funded by the territorial legislature for the purpose of drafting a constitution which would demonstrate Hawaii's fitness for statehood. IMUA, of course, had no official role in the Constitutional Convention, but had taken it upon itself to send a questionnaire to each of the candidates seeking to be delegates at the convention. IMUA's questions were of the following type: do you favor a state government patterned upon the individual, free enterprise system, or patterned to provide a welfare or social type of government? And, to what extent do you believe in the rights of collective bargaining and the right to strike? Bassett, it turned out, had more to worry about than IMUA. While the territory of Hawaii was electing a very safe slate of delegates to the Constitutional Convention, Bassett found himself being denounced as a communist in the nationally syndicated column of labor writer Victor Riesel. Mayor John Wilson was most curious about Riesel's source of information, with good cause in light of Riesel's earlier association with Governor Steinbach. Wilson wrote to 4 friends in Washington, D.C. to ascertain whether Steinbach were involved. Mayor Wilson was concerned about more than Bassett's reputation, since Riesel had called the mayor a fatigued elderly fellow who was totally under the domination of the red-tinged Bassett. Steinbach, by contrast, was referred to as an intelligent and sophisticated opponent of communists and communism. Bassett wrote a 3-page letter to Secretary of Interior Oscar Chapman explaining that he was not, nor had he ever been a member of the Communist Party, and that the Pacific Weekly, a paper he had published in Carmel, California in 1935, did not follow the Communist Party line as Riesel had charged. There was yet more drama on the national scene before the HUAC hearings began in Hawaii. The nation, stunned in 1949 by the Soviet Union's detonation of an atomic bomb, learned that Klaus Fuchs, the British physicist who had worked on the atomic bomb project at Los Alamos, New Mexico during World War II, had confessed and been convicted in March 1950 of having turned over critical drawings of the bomb to the Soviet Union. The web, which would eventually involve Harry Gold, David Greenglass, Morton Sobel, and Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, was beginning to reveal itself. To add fuel to the fires of international intrigue, only days after Fuchs' conviction, Judith Kaplan and a Russian engineer named Valentin Yubachev were found guilty in New York of conspiracy and attempted espionage. Excitement of a different variety was provided by the passage of a Hawaiian statehood bill by the U.S. House of Representatives by the impressive margin of 212 to 110. This gave fresh impetus to the coming Constitutional Convention, and when the final election of delegates was held on March 23, 1950, almost 80% of Hawaii's eligible voters turned out. The Constitutional Convention opened on April 4, 1950, with Kauai businessman Randolph Crossley acting as temporary chairman. Crossley handed the gavel over to Samuel W. King, who served as permanent chairman. Governor Steinbach delivered a speech which was filled with hope and confidence to the assembled delegates, all of whom had taken an oath declaring that they were not now, nor had they in the past 5 years been a member of the Communist Party. It was an oath which one delegate would personally repudiate with his surprise testimony before HUAC less than a week after the convention began. The subcommittee sent to Hawaii by HUAC was chaired by the Democratic Representative Francis E. Walter of Pennsylvania. HUAC, as it operated in 1950, advertised itself as the New Look Committee, and it did, indeed, lack some of the flamboyance HUAC had known during the heyday of Martin Dies, John Rankin, and the recently disgraced J. Parnell Thomas. Footnote: an outstanding and highly readable history of the House Committee on Un-American Activities is Walter Goodman, the committee. Goodman points out that Francis Walter was a Democrat who was proud of his record with labor and was a critic of the excesses of the committee during its wilder days. Walter, as a matter of fact, had such stature in the House of Representatives that he was, at one point, frequently spoken of as a likely successor to Sam Rayburn as Speaker of the House. It is Goodman's contention that an excessive commitment to anti-communism did things to people. Goodman said of the communist hunters, their careers were built on the immutable menace of communism. The anti-communism which, for most of them, had begun in honest disillusion and justified outrage had hardened into unquestioning faith, having given themselves to one truth. They could tolerate no other, and now nothing that happened in the real world could shake their belief in the less complicated world whose gates they guarded. With reference to Walter, specifically, Goodman commented that when he died in 1963 of leukemia, Francis Walter left behind a distinguished record in general which had been distorted by his HUAC experience. Like the respectable burgher turned loose in a brothel, he gave way to his surroundings. But the Francis Walter who came to Honolulu in 1950 was restrained and responsible. He did not harangue the witnesses, and he did not allow his colleagues to do so excessively. It was during the years of his chairmanship, from 1955 to 63, that Walter's xenophobia became more pronounced and he succumbed to the brothel of which Goodman spoke. Footnote end. In addition to Francis Walter, the other subcommittee members were Burr P. Harrison of Virginia, John McSweeney of Ohio, Morgan Mulder of Missouri, and Harold H. Velda, a former FBI agent from Illinois. HUAC members not participating in the Hawaii hearings including Chairman John S. Wood of Georgia and Richard M. Nixon of California. Nixon, who had been the real star of the committee in 1948, was, in 1950, preparing to take on Helen Gahagan Douglas for a seat in the United States Senate. Footnote: Walter Goodman commented on Nixon's role with HUAC, stating, Nixon's career was famously expedited by the Hiss case. He was Bolingbroke to Richard II, his bucket dancing in the air as hisses sunk down and down, but the qualities he showed on the committee would have carried him forward in any event. He was smart, energetic, and a very fast learner of what he needed to know. He could be dogged yet agile. He had a nice instinct for when to bet high and when to cut his losses. The committee had helped to make him, but he, more than any other member, had been responsible for giving the committee its great year. As that year drew to a close, no one could doubt that Richard Nixon's future was exceedingly bright. As for the committee itself, however, it would not again attain the resplendency of 1948. Footnote end. There was much speculation in Hawaii over the predisposition of HUAC members in the matter of statehood for the territory. According to reliable sources quoted in the Honolulu Star Bulletin, HUAC members favored statehood for Hawaii by a 6-2 margin in a straw vote taken in Washington, D.C., after having previewed the evidence which had been gathered by the committee's investigators. On the day the hearings began, Chairman Walter made it clear that he was aware of the Butler report, but took the opposite view from that of the senator from Nebraska. But in his opening remarks, Walter made clear his very serious purpose. The citizens of Hawaii have written a noble page in American history during the last war against totalitarian fascism. They have faced death with unflinching heroism and self-sacrifice. Today we are confronted with a new menace, the menace of totalitarian communism, which would destroy our democracy and lead us all down the road to slavery. This menace must be pitilessly exposed for what it is. The first of 66 witnesses came as a great surprise to the people of the territory of Hawaii. It was Richard Kejama, an elected member of the Board of Supervisors for the city and county of Honolulu and, more recently, an elected and sworn delegate to Hawaii's Constitutional Convention. Only 6 days before, Kejama had sworn that he was not, and had not for the last 5 years been a member of the Communist Party. Now, on April 10, 1950, Richard Kejama revealed to HUAC the fact that he had been a member of the Communist Party for a period of 9 months in 1947. A former student of John Rieneke's on the Big Island, Kejama told how he had contacted his former teacher when he first came to Oahu in 1946. He told of joining a Marxist study group and then how Charles K. Fujimoto had asked him to join the party. Kejama told HUAC that he had received his party card from John Rieneke in February 1947. Disillusion was not long in coming. Kejama told the committee, "I found that the Communist Party was not meant for the people who live in a democratic nation," he explained. "I was disillusioned by the belief that they were for the common and underprivileged people, which, in later years, has proven to be otherwise." Footnote: HUAC Hearings, Hawaii, 1950, p. 1359. Kejama's testimony points to one of the central features of the legislative hearings as a means to the truth. In a court of law, Kejama would have been subjected to cross-examination, and it is likely that the opposing counsel would have pointed out the fact that Kejama's departure from the Communist Party coincided with the beginning of Governor Steinbach's campaign against communism in Hawaii in November 1947. Counsel likely would have sought to show that it was fear of discovery rather than honest disillusion which drove Kejama out of the party. Footnote end. Kejama's testimony about the Communist Party itself provided no new revelations about that organization, but he did cause at least a small ripple of interest when he told how, when the first HUAC subpoenas were being issued, Charles Fujimoto contacted him and instructed him to go to Harried Bauslog should he be served with one. Fujimoto, of course, was unaware that Kejama had already agreed to appear before HUAC as a friendly witness. When Kejama did appear, it was with his own counsel, Yasutaka Fukushima. The most troubling aspect of Kejama's appearance was that, although he had agreed to appear as early as November 1949, he went ahead and ran as a delegate to the Constitutional Convention. Surely he knew he would be required to sign a loyalty oath. Kejama explained this act by revealing that HUAC investigator William A. Wheeler, who had first contacted him on November 7, 1949, told me that I would be called by this committee as an important witness when hearings were held here in Hawaii. He also impressed upon me the importance of disclosing this information to no one, no matter what the cost. Kejama's point was that his failure to seek a delegate's position for the Constitutional Convention might have tipped people off that something unusual was happening. There were a number of assertions that Kejama was acting in concert with the Steinbach wing of the Democratic Party. Gorman Nolan, a member of the Democratic Territorial Central Committee, was quoted in the Honolulu Record as having said that Kejama had been advised to run as a delegate to the Constitutional Convention by people in high places. Dr. Ernest Murai, another member of the Central Committee, indicated that he felt sorry for Kejama who was being used. Lau Achu, chairman of the Central Committee, was less charitable, asserting, "Kejama has struck a foul blow not only at the Democratic Party but primarily at our hopes for statehood." Lau revealed that Kejama was no longer a member of the Democratic Party, having automatically relinquished membership when he joined the Communist Party, in violation of the Democratic Party's rule which stipulated that no member could belong to another political party. But if there were those who criticized Kejama's actions, there were also those who found them praiseworthy. HUAC Subcommittee Chairman Francis Walter praised Kejama for his courage and asked that Kejama not be punished for his efforts. Walter indicated that, in my judgment, my party in Hawaii might better think of a thorough spring housecleaning instead of discrediting courageous, real Americans. Footnote: Honolulu Advertiser, April 14, 1950, p. 1. There followed a heated exchange between Francis Walter and Lau Achu in which Lau went so far as to wire President Truman in Washington, D.C., to protest Walter's intrusion into Hawaii's internal politics. Walter retorted that Lau and his ilk should not be recognized in party circles in Washington. The Advertiser quoted Walter's parting volley in an editorial. Congressman Walter said with gentle and smiling and genial but withering disdain, "Lau Achu is not my kind of Democrat." The next chapter will trace the disintegrating forces at work within Hawaii's Democratic Party in 1950. Footnote end. Governor Steinbach made a statement which suggested that there was some kind of alliance between him and Kejama. Richard Kejama is to be commended for his courageous statement to the subcommittee of the House Committee on Un-American Activities Monday at Iolani Palace. Mr. Kejama's determination to tell the truth, regardless of personal consequences, should serve as an example to others in the territory. Mr. Kejama is probably a victim rather than a culprit, having fallen under the influence of his former teacher John Rienecki. In interviews with the author in September 1974 and February 1975, Richard Kejama insisted that he had acted on his own and without any arrangement with Governor Steinbach. Kejama expressed no bitterness over the events which had interrupted his very promising political career. Footnote: Interviews with Richard Kejama, September 28, 1974 and February 22, 1975. One reason for the charges of collusion between Kejama and Steinbach was that, at his first meeting of the Board of Supervisors after the HUAC hearings, Kejama was presented with a floral lei by John K. Akow, a close political ally of Governor Steinbach. Kejama insisted that this gesture by Akow was a personal one and had to do with Kejama's assistance to Akow and his veterans' housing project in Paolo rather than any deal with Steinbach. At the time of the September 28, 1974 interview between Kejama and the author, Kejama was attempting an unsuccessful second comeback in Oahu politics, seeking the Democratic nomination for a seat on the City Council, the new name for the Board of Supervisors. Kejama finished a distant fourth in a four-way race. Kejama finished his term of office as a member of the Board of Supervisors in 1950 despite efforts to force his resignation and even to have him impeached. He did not stand for re-election in 1950, for even if he had won he could not have signed the loyalty oath which would then have been required of him, stating that he was not and had not for 5 years been a member of the Communist Party, without perjuring himself. It was clear that neither the city and county of Honolulu nor the territory of Hawaii wanted to prosecute Kejama in 1950 for his past transgressions, but they would not have allowed Kejama, had he wished to make another perjured oath with impunity. Kejama ran for the Board of Supervisors again in 1952. He would have been out of the Communist Party for more than 5 years by the time he was required to take the oath, but lost. In 1954 and 1956, his campaigns were successful and Kejama did serve 2 more terms on the Board of Supervisors. Footnote end. At the Constitutional Convention, there were mixed feelings about how to handle Richard Kejama as a delegate. He had obviously perjured himself when he took the loyalty oath, but there were those like Randolph Crossley of Kauai who felt Kejama should be commended rather than expelled. A letter of commendation introduced to the Constitutional Convention by Crossley was rejected. Kejama made it easy for the delegates by resigning, saying, "Further attendance at the Constitutional Convention as a delegate would embarrass my fellow delegates and prejudice the cause of statehood for Hawaii." If Richard Kejama's testimony came as a surprise, the testimony of the second witness before HUAC was highly predictable, with one major exception. The witness was Akiro Izuka, and the testimony he gave followed closely the information contained in his 1947 pamphlet, The Truth About Communism in Hawaii, and his 1948 testimony before the Territorial Commissioners of Public Instruction. Footnote: There was a total of 455 pages of direct testimony in the transcript of the HUAC hearings in Hawaii. 72 of those pages contained the testimony of HUAC's investigators William A. Wheeler and Courtney E. Owens. Izuka's testimony is contained in 67 pages of the remaining 382 pages of the transcript. This means that Izuka's testimony represented 17.5% of all testimony given by local witnesses. The other 65 local witnesses averaged less than 5 pages of transcript each. None had more than 17. This arithmetical exercise is performed to show how central Izuka's testimony was to the HUAC hearings. Footnote end. The one surprise in Izuka's testimony raised a furor which was equal to that which resulted from Richard Kejama's testimony. Izuka named Frank G. Silva, ILWU business agent from Kauai and a delegate to the Constitutional Convention, as a member of the Communist Party in Hawaii. Izuka's testimony did not lend itself to any questions of interpretation. It was not the case of a witness placing a man at a meeting of the Communist Party and drawing possibly incorrect inferences thereby. That sort of testimony was not uncommon, but Izuka was not ambiguous. Frank Silva, I knew Frank Silva for a long time in the plantation, and many efforts was made to recruit Frank Silva in the Communist Party, but the only one who can contact him was Jack Hall, and Jack Hall did, or was instructed many times to recruit Frank Silva. But I think that no contact was made for a long time, officially, but after Frank Silva volunteered for the army and after discharge from the army, I had many talks with him in the restaurant, and finally one day at Pier 11, he told me, "Well, Ikai, are you a communist? Did you join the Communist Party?" One eye and I said, "Yes, I joined way back in 1938. 11, and he told me that he joined the party, and he showed me high card. That is the only incident that I know that Frank Silva told me that. He showed me the card. He said, "IISEE my card, this is my card." 1I-29. The question was not over the interpretation of Izuka's statement, but the veracity. It was subject to serious question. HUAC counsel, Frank Taverner, asked Izuka when the alleged meeting with Silva had taken place. Izuka responded, "Oh, I believe it was after the sugar strike, sometime early in 1947. 11:30. That date would certainly square with the end of the sugar strike, which came on November 19, 1946, but it seemed a doubtful conversation for Izuka to be having in early 1947, since he had testified that he had resigned from the Communist Party of Hawaii on October 20, 1946. Though he had nothing to fear in the way of cross-examination, Taverner realized that Izuka's testimony was erroneous and would easily be exposed as such. So Taverner recalled Izuka and asked him if he wished to correct any errors in his earlier testimony. Izuka replied, "Yes, by reading the papers, I found out that I would like to make a correction on the part when I said that Frank Silva showed me his party card in 1947. I am sure it is all of the members who joined the Communist Party, including Frank Silva, that was during the time before I resigned from the party in 1946, and that actually took part during the same time, instead of 1947. Footnote, HUAC Hearings, Hawaii, 1950, p. 1471. This quotation is shown exactly as it appears in the transcript. It was not uncharacteristic of Izuka when he was flustered. During the Reineki hearing, such statements were subjected to the withering cross-examination of defense counsel Richard Gladstein. At the HUAC hearing, there was no cross-examination, and HUAC counsel Taverner allowed Izuka's correction to his testimony to stand without so much as a question about what the witness was attempting to say. Footnote end. After Izuka's initial statement, Frank Silva was immediately issued a subpoena to appear before HUAC to respond to Izuka's charge. On April 13, 1950, Silva appeared before the committee and took the Fifth Amendment privilege against self-incrimination. Silva, who subsequently declared that he was not and had never been a member of the Communist Party, explained his unwillingness to testify in the following way. Akiro Izuka had testified falsely that he was a communist, but should he deny that he was a member of the Communist Party before HUAC, he could be subject to indictment for perjury should the grand jury believe Izuka rather than Silva. The freshness of the conviction of Alger Hiss for having perjured himself before HUAC might have given Silva's argument some force, but it did not. The members of the Constitutional Convention felt that an innocent person should have nothing to hide from a committee of Congress, and, by a vote of 53-7, they expelled Frank Silva from the convention. Footnote, Honolulu Advertiser, April 21, 1950, p. 2. This rather tortured interpretation of the Fifth Amendment was not at all uncommon to anti-communists in the late 1940s and early 1950s. For a valuable study of the question, see Carl Beck, Contempt of Congress. Footnote end. In all, 39 witnesses took shelter behind the Fifth Amendment during the HUAC hearings in Hawaii. They came to be known as the Reluctant 39. All were cited for contempt of Congress. Footnote, the Reluctant 39 were all represented by the law firm of Bauslag and Simmons, and all submitted an identical motion to quash the subpoena commanding them to appear before HUAC on the grounds that it violated their constitutional rights under the First, Fourth, Fifth, Ninth, and 10th Amendments. A copy of the motion to quash appears at the end of this work as Appendix H. It is first found in the transcript of the HUAC hearings in Hawaii on pp. 1472-73. A list of the Reluctant 39, in order of their appearance before the committee, is found at the end of this work as Appendix I. Footnote N. They would have been known as the Reluctant 47 were it not for the fact that 7 individuals were released from their subpoenas, and one could not be served. Footnote, the 7 who were released were Mrs. Charles Fujimoto, Mr. and Mrs. Robert Wenkamp, Mrs. Robert McElrath, Mrs. Jack Hall, Mrs. Ralph Fosbrink, and Mrs. John Reinecke. There was obviously some chivalry at work here. The witness who could not be served was David Thompson. In a March 13, 1975 interview with the author, Thompson declined to comment on his unavailability, preferring to allow his absence speak for itself. Footnote end. An analysis of the composition of the Reluctant 39 reveals the most significant feature of the HUAC hearings in Hawaii, the apparent involvement of a significant number of ILWU leaders in the Communist Party. Of the Reluctant, all of whom were identified by some witness as being a member of the Communist Party, 26 stated under oath that they were either an officer or an employee of the ILWU. The list not only included the ILWU's regional director, Jack Hall, but such notable leaders of the union as Ernest Arena, president of ILWU Local 150, Marshall McEwen, who had been the co-director of the ILWU's Political Action Committee, Robert McElrath, the ILWU's public relations director, and Jack Kawano, former president of ILWU Local 136. Others on the list included many with close relationships with the ILWU: Ralph Fosbrink, president of the Oahu CIO Council; Danishi Jack Komodo, the number 2 man at the Honolulu Record; Rachel Seiki, an employee of the Record; and Jeanette Nakama Robau, wife of a staff writer for the Record. 3 of the reluctant 39 told the committee they were unemployed: John E. Rienecki, the dismissed school teacher, and Mr. and Mrs. Dwight James Freeman. Mr. Freeman was frequently mentioned as an organizer for the Communist Party who had been sent to Hawaii by District 13, California, and Hawaii headquarters in San Francisco immediately after the war. Evidence was offered which demonstrated that Pearl Freeman, Jim Freeman's wife, had been an openly registered member of the Communist Party in California before coming to Hawaii with her husband. One of the 39 whose unwillingness to testify attracted considerable attention was Wilfred Aka, the fiery little secretary of the Oahu County Democratic Central Committee. It was Aka who had given the ILWU great assistance in 1948 when the Union turned away from the Political Action Committee and toward the Democratic Party as the better vehicle for the achievement of political strength. 2 of the 39 were significantly identified as officers of the Hawaii Civil Liberties Committee, HCLC, the civil liberties group formed at the time of the suspension of John and Eiko Rienecki. The 2 were Esther M. Bristow and Stephen Murin. Steve Murin was also identified as an employee of the United Public Workers of America, one of the CLU unions which had only recently been expelled due to excessive communist influence. Charges that the primary purpose of the HUAC hearings was to bust the ILWU were frequent. Ralph Tokunaga, former president of ILWU Local 150, and one of the reluctant 39, gave force to such charges when he took to the radio to explain the reason he had not testified freely before the committee. Ralph Tokunaga's desire not to be a witness against himself was not, however, realized. William A. Wheeler, a HUAC investigator, had interviewed Tokunaga on November 22, 1949. After Tokunaga left the stand on April 12, 1950, having refused to testify, Wheeler was sworn as a witness and proceeded to play for the committee a recording of his November interview with the former ILWU officer. Tokunaga's conversation with Wheeler was filled with names of union members who were associated with the Communist Party in Hawaii. It was from such interviews that the staff of HUAC prepared itself for the interrogation of witnesses at the hearings. In the interview with Wheeler, Tokunaga had freely admitted having been a member of the Communist Party. He described his reasons for leaving the party. Akiro Izuka put out a pamphlet about communism in Hawaii, and that thing made such a big splash in the newspapers that I was scared. I didn't know what it was all about, and just from what I saw at the meetings and Akiro Izuka said did not jibe, and I started thinking and told myself that there might be more than what's on the surface. This idea about communists being the vanguard of the working people sounded alright, but the ideas about communism taking over the world and making this world, etc., had me scared. I didn't like the idea of any revolutionary overthrow of the government. I like this government. It's done all right by me. Tokunaga's recorded testimony seems to have been typical of the experience of many rank-and-file union members who became involved with the Communist Party in Hawaii. They joined as an adjunct to their union membership, with the understanding that their membership would add to union solidarity and thereby benefit the movement. The success of the union was their key concern. When they were confronted with communist theory, they became disinterested, confused, or frightened. And when communism became a burning public issue, particularly with the publication of the Izuka pamphlet, there apparently was a good deal of scurrying to get out of the Communist Party. The final witness to appear before the committee was Edward Berman, the controversial, outspoken Honolulu attorney. Berman had offered himself as a witness after Emil Muller, a friendly HUAC witness, had placed him at what Muller had thought was a Communist Party meeting in 1938. When Taverner pushed Muller a bit, the witness indicated that he was not sure the meeting in question was actually a Communist Party meeting. He had no personal knowledge that Berman was a member of the Communist Party, and that he had seen Berman at no other meeting of the Communist Party he had attended while he was a member. Footnote: IMUA Spotlight, April 1950, p. 1. In the same issue, IMUA reported that Hawaii's Communist Party, according to very reliable sources, has approximately $2,000 a month to conduct the communist program. When John Rienecki was asked about these figures in an interview on June 20, 1973, he merely laughed. It turns out that IMUA derived this figure, primarily, by estimating the monthly public relations budget of the ILWU under the assumption that the union was nothing more or less than an arm of the Communist Party. Footnote end.